Night Out, Lights Out. A horror short story. Lynn, her husband Samuel, and their 3-year-old Emerson stood on the parking lot in front of their house, waving their friends goodbye as they left towards their cars or the bus stop across the street. "Thanks again for the lovely evening and get home safe," called Lynn. Stefan's shirt caught her eye. It was still covered with bits of food from when she cracked some crisp bread right in front of his face. He did deserve it, though, questioning the popularity of crisp and crunch. "And remember, no crunch, no lunch." The others laughed and giggled at that remark, appreciating it as one of many inside jokes that were born that evening. They said their goodbyes once more and waved back as they got in their cars. Once everyone had left, Samuel, still holding on to Emerson's hand so he wouldn't fall over, turned around and looked down at the little one, who was staring back up at him with an expression on his face as if he was completely and utterly confused as to what in the world had just transpired in this very place. "Come on, Em, let's go back inside and grab something to eat, said Samuel in a higher tone. Lynn chuckled when she saw Em's face and quickly caught up with the two. "What a lovely evening! You even seem to get along with Lisbeth this time, Sam," she said cheerfully. Sam smiled and nodded. "Well, you took great care to make this evening so lovely. Really got everyone in the right mood." The two got back inside the house to the front door. The door had fallen shut, so Lynn took Em while Sam unlocked the door and had it open for them. Lynn and Em walked right back into their kitchen, the first door to the right, while Sam closed the door and was about to follow when he remembered he could just lock the door already. Lynn had just helped Em in his chair at the dinner table when Sam entered the kitchen too and quickly grabbed the rest of their food they had kept for themselves. Once the table was all set and nice, they sat down together to eat. Both Lynn and Sam filled their plates eagerly, but before she took her first bite, she turned to Em, who was being surprisingly still. "You want some noodles too, Emmet?" Em shook his head and crossed his arms. "What do you want to eat?" He shook his head again.
I'm hungry.
"Really? Not even a little bit?" He ate with the others earlier, remember?" threw Sam in before taking another bite. Lynn tried to recall the evening for a moment. "Oh, right. Sorry, Em." Lynn turned back to her own food, and they talked about the evening a bit more as they ate. As Sam was talking, Lynn's gaze wandered out through their front window over their kitchen counter. Sam's words slowly faded into background noise, and her chewing slowed down as her wandering gaze slowly turned into a stare, attempting to discern a faintly visible silhouette across the street. When her chewing stopped completely and her expression changed, Sam became aware she wasn't listening anymore. He followed her stare out the window, across the street. He saw the bus stop, but nothing of interest. He turned back to Lynn, who was still engulfed by whatever caught her attention. "Lynn?" Lynn suddenly snapped out of her trance, finished chewing, and swallowed. "Sorry, I was just a bit thrown off by that weird woman at the bus stop," she said, glancing back and forth between Sam and the bus stop. Sam granted the bus stop another closer look from himself too now. "What weird woman? What do you mean?" He still saw nothing yet. I can barely make out the silhouette of a tall woman standing eerily at the edge of the street by the bus stop," explained Lynn. "And I think she's staring at our house." Sam squinted and finally began to identify the mentioned silhouette when a bus suddenly arrived and held at the bus stop. Both Sam and Lynn were still staring out the window, invested in the mystery, waiting for the bus to leave. The bus, however, stood still for a while. Sam and Lynn glanced at each other in confusion. Sam looked at the remainder of his food for a moment and took a quick last bite before looking back outside the window. The bus finally seemed to depart. They didn't really see if or when the bus doors opened, but judging from the reflections, the bus now closed its doors again and slowly began to drive away. As it accelerated, the anticipation for what it might reveal rose with it. And what did it reveal? Nothing. Just an empty bus stop. The woman was gone. Sam and Lynn looked at each other in relief, even though they tried to pretend they weren't worried. Lynn turned her attention back to her food, while Sam carefully scraped the rest of his plate.
Hello, big woman.
Em's cheerfully spoken words shot through their heads like a bolt of lightning, and shivers went down their spines. Lynn immediately glanced at Em and followed his gaze toward the open door leading to the empty hallway. It was empty, right? "Emmet, who did you talk to?" asked Sam carefully, his sight still bound to the opened door, but Em just smiled and reached for a slice of bread. Lynn looked at Sam, fear visible in her eyes. You closed the door, right? She asked as quietly as she managed, while obviously restless. Don't interpret too much into it. He probably just...
Did you?
Interrupted Lynn, almost jumping off her seat, leaning over the table. Of course I did. I made sure I locked it as well. The two just remained still for a moment and listened. But there was nothing. Sam got up out of his seat. I'm gonna take a look, he said as he walked up to the door and placed his hand on the handle. He waited for a moment in case there was a sound or Lynn wanted to say something. Neither was the case. He slowly and quietly opened the door and stepped out into the dark hallway. He stepped through the dark and felt along the wall to hit the light switch next to the front door. The hallway lit up, and Sam could see that the front door was still closed. He checked if it was locked. Also still true. He glanced out through the door's small window, but saw nothing but black, so he turned the lights back off. It all seemed calm outside. He turned around to face the hallway once more. He left the lights off, since the full moon gave him enough light to see everything once his eyes had adapted to the dark, and this way he could see out through the bigger windows further back. He finally began walking through towards the other end of their house. Stairs down to the basement and up to their bedroom and bathroom on his left, and a wall of windows providing a view on the terrace and garden, but also back into their kitchen to his right. Lynn watched through the windows from the kitchen how Sam stepped through the latter part of the hallway that ended in a door out to the garden and one to their guest bathroom. Sam took a quick peek inside the bathroom and then turned back around and walked up the stairs to their bedroom. Lynn knew that that meant that only 2 areas of their home would be left unchecked: the garden and their basement. She glanced at Em, who was just calmly munching on a slice of bread. She heard the neighbor's dog barking and her gaze wandered over to their garden. Maybe she should cut away a few branches again. Started to grow a bit overgrown. A reflection caught her eye. There was something in the bushes. A cat? She noticed a second reflection next to it, which was only revealed when the wind blew the leaves aside, and she now definitely recognized the slightly yellowish reflections as eyes. She stared at the reflections as they stared back. The moment was only broken by Em tugging at her shirt. At the second tug, she quickly looked down at him and back up, but had noticed he dropped his last slice of bread and was about to cry. She made sure the glass door was locked and ripped her gaze off the garden, calmed Em, and brought him another slice of bread. She knew he was tired and easily upset because of it. She looked back out into the garden, but reflections were gone. Looking around a bit more, she noticed the door connecting their garden and the hallway wasn't closed properly, and her heart began to race. Was it this way before? Did they just forget? Either way, this was bad, and she had to at least go and close the door. She thought about taking Em with her, but figured he was at least just as safe there, and this way he'd stay happy and calm. So she set out on her own, stepping out into the dark hallway and quietly closing the door behind her to let her eyes adjust to the darkness. No sign of anyone or anything out of the ordinary. That definitely wasn't a relief for her yet, though. She peered down the stairs leading to the basement. She realized she couldn't check both the garden and the basement at the same time. She hesitated for a moment, but then quietly stepped further down the hallway. Sam would surely come back down any moment now. As she stepped along the glass wall, her eyes darted back and forth, quickly scanning the outside while constantly checking behind her again to make sure nobody would leave the basement without her realizing. She quickly shut the door out to the garden properly and quietly hurried back in front of the kitchen door, staring down into the basement. She peeked back into the kitchen to check on Em. It was all still calm. She turned her attention back to the basement and decided she'd stay put until Sam came back down. The anticipation grew unbearable very quickly. She had the horrible feeling something would happen any moment now. As she stared fixed on the darkness of the descent, she barely blinked, her vision covering with black and grey noise. Finally, a footstep from above broke her trance, and Sam came walking down the stairs. He smiled at the nervous but relieved Lynn, whose skin was slowly losing its color. "Everything's fine up there," he whispered. "Basement?" She pointed down and looked at Sam pleadingly, not wanting to say anything more. Sam looked at her a bit worried for a moment. Sure. Lynn stepped aside and Sam slowly descended. If there was ever a moment to regret still having a light switch in the basement itself, it was now. At least during the day, some light would fall in through the window on the other side and bounce off the walls. As he neared the bottom of the staircase, he could peek into the basement itself further and further, but with nothing but darkness, there wasn't much to discern. It was eerily quiet. Once he stepped off the last step and onto the basement floor, he quickly felt along the wall behind him, desperately searching for the light switch. His heart started racing, and he felt like even the darkness itself before him became more and more dense and came to suffocate him. There it was! He flipped the switch, and the single light bulb in the middle of the large room before him lit up for a second, before suddenly bursting into pieces, shards of glass flying across the room. Sam sprung back in shock, covering his face with his arms, a few shards slicing up his skin. He tried to remain calm and reached out behind him to find the stairs again. He still heard some shards bouncing across the ground, but there was something else mixed in there now. His hand grew more hectic as it felt along the wall. He had accidentally backed up into the corner. That sound, like someone walking on the shards. He had the bad feeling someone or something else was in there with him, and he wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. He threw away his care to be quiet and scrambled along the wall and across the shards. The sound of calm but heavy breathing crept up behind him. He slipped with his hand off the wall and stumbled upon the stairs, scrambling to crawl up and get on his feet. He ran up the stairs, backed up against the front door, grabbing an umbrella as an improvised means of defense. But nothing followed him. He carefully reached for his phone with his non-dominant hand and dialed 911. While Sam descended into the basement, Lynn had gone back into the kitchen to check on Em. But he was gone. Panicking, Lynn called for Em, but got no response. She glanced outside and recognized the reflections of their eyes before. Her gaze locked on them for a moment as she reached for the handle of the glass door and gave it a pull to check if it was locked. To her surprise, the door slid open before her. Her heart was racing once more. She didn't like the eyes now staring at her with no glass door between them anymore, and she quickly pushed it shut again, leaning against it with her back for a moment, looking round the room for any clue of Em once more.
Em, where are you?
She called out once more. No response. Anxiously, she turned back around to face the garden. She pulled the door back open, stepped outside, and grabbed the flashlight they had left on the terrace after gardening, closing the door again behind her.
Em!
She called out once more, still staring back at the eyes lurking in the bushes. The light from the kitchen illuminated the terrace where she was standing, but ended at the grass of the garden. She stepped forward to the edge of the grass when the eyes suddenly vanished with a gust of wind. The loud blowing of the wind was unnerving to her, as it felt to her as if she had just lost one of her senses. She quickly flipped the switch of her flashlight as she held it up to the bushes before her, and the light rapidly flickered for a moment before the inside of the flashlight suddenly burst apart with shards of glass flung out the front of it. Lynn quickly dropped it as she stumbled backwards. She slipped on the wet grass but turned while falling, catching herself with both her hands and quickly getting back up on her feet. She felt a sharp pain shoot through her hands. Just as she was about to dash away, something suddenly grabbed her by the foot and pulled her back. As she slipped to the floor, being dragged back to the grass, horrified, she looked behind her. A somewhat messed up human silhouette stared back at her with the familiar yellowish reflections of its eyes. She used her free leg to kick against its head as hard as she could, over and over, until finally she was released from its grip. Suddenly, the door to the end of the hallway swung open and Sam came rushing outside. "Lynn, grab my hand!" Lynn quickly reached for Sam's hand as she tried to get back up on her feet. The glass shards stuck in her hands, cutting deeper as she tried to lift herself. Sam helped her up properly and dragged her with him through the open door and into the hallway, quickly and forcefully shutting the door behind them. Lynn immediately ripped apart from Sam. "We need to get Em!" she yelled and scurried through the hallway towards the other end. Sirens were audible in the distance. Sam ran after her and reached the door to the kitchen before her, quickly pushing down the handle and tackling the door with his shoulder. But as the door swung open, the light bulbs all throughout the halls almost simultaneously shattered, and they were engulfed by complete darkness. They had to stop in their tracks and let their eyes adjust for a moment. As their vision slowly returned, they saw that before them, in the middle of the room, staring right at them, was a crooked, tall woman and horrifying skinny figure with dark green, almost black skin, eyes glowing in a yellow tint, and a creepy white smile decorating her wrinkled face and tilted head. Her slightly grey-brown hair looked like it might fall out any moment, and her arms were unusually long and disfigured with long, cold nails between broken ones. With one hand she was holding onto a chair, slowly swinging it back and forth. Em was sitting in it, smiling and giggling.